Hey everyone, welcome back. We are now in week 8 of the trimester, already over halfway through the term. Time is just flying by, and this is the time at which we begin to take a step out of the world of first-order cybernetics and into the world of second-order cybernetics, which is a conceptual and epistemological leap, but one that I will help to guide you through with this lecture and the lecture for next week. This week's readings gave you a bit of an introduction to second-order cybernetics and, most importantly, contrasted it with first-order cybernetics. I hope that by the end of this week's lecture you have a clearer understanding of what second-order cybernetics is and how it compares and differs from first-order cybernetics. So let's jump right into this. First order versus second order cybernetics. It's an important distinction for us to review. And the essential difference between first order and second order cybernetics, the real important thing for you to keep in mind, is the position of the observer is what determines whether we are in first order cybernetics territory or second order cybernetics territory. As we went over a few weeks ago, in first-order cybernetics, the observer is positioned outside of the system that he or she is observing. In second-order cybernetics, by contrast, the observer is included in his or her observations of the system being observed. So let me ground this in the context in which it's going to be most appropriate for all of us. If we're taking a first-order cybernetic approach as a therapist or as a coach, we are going to be looking at the system as though we are not a part of it. Okay? We're going to be standing outside of the system, however we define the system, whether that's the family that's sitting in front of us in our office, whether it's an organization, whether it's a school, or whether it's a subsystem of a school like a teacher and a student. Right? Whatever the system is that we're observing, we're going to consider only that system. And we're not going to include ourselves in the observation. We're not going to take that into consideration. We're only going to look at how the system is operating and how the participants that we're observing, right, the members of the system that we're observing are interacting with one another. We're going to be looking at the patterns. We're going to be looking at feedback, right? We're going to be looking at all the first-order cybernetic stuff. The circular causality, right? The recursive processes going on in the system, the communication going on in the system, looking at maybe some binds that we're observing, some gaps in communication, right? Lack of congruence between the digital and analog, the level of homeostatic balance in the system, all of these things that we talked about when we covered first-order cybernetics, we're going to be observing those. And we're only going to be looking at those things. Now, let's step into second-order cybernetics territory. Same thing. You're a therapist with a family in your office, right? Or you're a coach that's working with a student and one of his or her teachers. Or looking at the student and considering him or her in the context of the whole school system or their family system or any other system. Now, when you're making your observations about what's going on in the system, you're going to be taking into consideration your own participation in this system and your own participation in the assumptions you're making about the system, in your interpretations of what you're seeing, in the conclusions that you're drawing about what you're seeing, in your decisions about how to intervene and when and where and with whom. This time, rather than simply looking from a distanced position at what's going on in that system, you're going to be taking into consideration your own perspectives, your own view, your own involvement, your own participation, your own interactions with this system. You are now part of the system. You are now part of what is being observed. So you are now the observer and part of what you are observing. That's the difference between second-order cybernetics and first-order cybernetics, where you, the observer, are positioned when making your observations of the system. Second order cybernetics is commonly referred to as cybernetics of cybernetics, and that was just somebody having a whole lot of fun, confusing and dizzying us. But what you need to know about this and why it came about is it was developed through ideas of math, science, and philosophy. And some of the key figures that developed these ideas and wrote about these ideas, and I highly recommend that you look them up in Google Scholar and take a look at some of the scholarly articles that they've written, are von Forster, Maturana, and Varela. Those are three names famously and commonly associated with cybernetics of cybernetics, or for our purposes, second-order cybernetics. Now, the epistemological premises of second-order cybernetics correspond with the constructivist view, the constructivist philosophy or epistemology, which basically rests on the premise that we construct our own understandings about the world. Okay, so constructivists will tell you that everything we perceive and everything that we believe about the world around us is our own construction. That reality has to be filtered through our consciousness. And so our understanding of what reality is actually resides within our own constructed view of it, rather than existing out there in the world. Now, radical constructivists take it even further and say that there is no real world out there outside of our observations, and that all that exists is our projections and our interpretations of the world. But the bottom line is, constructivist epistemology states that we construct our own understandings about the world. So observing is a really active process because it involves creating realities. It involves constructing understandings. It involves designing interpretations, making assumptions that are filtered through our own truths, our own realities. So again, some of the basic premises of constructivism and second-order cybernetics are that all we describe is processed through our own epistemology and worldview. And because of this, we all punctuate, or in other words, focus on events differently. If you ask a painter to describe a certain scene, and then you ask, a scientist to describe the same scene, and then you ask a family therapist to describe the same scene, and then you ask a linguist to describe the same scene, and then you ask, an anthropologist to describe the same scene, you're going to get very divergent, very distinct descriptions of that scene, are you not? And each of those is going to be valid, but each of those is going to be situated in the perspective of the observer. Each of those observers is coming from a different epistemological view, and therefore is focusing on different aspects of that scene, looking for different things, and making, therefore, different assumptions and different interpretations about what's going on. So your understanding of what's going on is going to be quite different depending on who you ask. Make sense? All of our descriptions are self-referenced, meaning my description of something is going to refer more to myself than it is to what I'm observing. Let's ground this in the therapeutic context. I, as a therapist, am going to describe a presenting problem about what I'm seeing in therapy, right? I'm going to describe the problem that my clients came in with. And when I do that, my description is going to refer more to me, myself, than it will to the client. A good quote for understanding this is, reality is a personal construction. We see things not as they are, but as we are. If I define the presenting problem for my family that I'm working with in therapy as The kid is a pain in the ass. Mom and dad are terrible parents. The communication in the family is atrocious, and the family needs to implement some boundaries. I'm telling you something about this family, but even more than that, I'm telling you a whole lot about me. I'm telling you about the kinds of things I look for. I'm telling you about the kinds of things that I perceive as problematic, right? Like the language or the behavior of the child or the boundaries in the family. I'm telling you about my conception of optimal health in a family, right? Because you can presume that I'm looking for certain kinds of boundaries, certain kinds of communication, certain kinds of behavior from the child, and I didn't see it, so I'm describing it in negative terms. So I'm telling you a whole lot about myself in my attempts to tell you about that family. Therefore, my description is what we would call self-referenced, self-referential. It refers just as much to me as it does to what I'm describing. So you see now that the observer, which would have been me in that context as the therapist, is now part of the system that's being observed. Because the descriptions of that system include me, the observer. Again, second-order cybernetics is different from first-order cybernetics because it places the observer in that which is being observed. So the observer then is part of what he or she is observing. So here's an example of how this would work. Let's say I ask you to explain the difference between your description of NSU before you were a student here and now that you are a student here. So what this would do would really show the distinction between you being the observer outside of the system and you being part of the observation. And here's why. Because before you were a student at NSU, you were positioned outside of the NSU system. So your description of NSU wouldn't include you as part of the observation. Now you are in the system. You are now part of the NSU system. You are now a member of that system. You are now a participant of that system. So your description of the system now includes you. Your observation of the system now includes you, the observer. So your description from before you were part of the system to now after you are a member of the system is likely to be quite different. Before you were a member of the system, you would describe it in certain terms. After you consider yourself the observer as part of what you're observing, the way you look at things changes, the way you talk about things changes. What you notice, what you pay attention to, all shift as a consequence of you taking yourself, the observer, into consideration in your observations. The same happens in therapy. Because a therapist is not an objective person doing therapy with a family system. We as therapists are part of the systems that we work with. A family therapist realizes that he or she cannot be outside the family system with no preconceived ideas or biases. In fact, no therapist can be outside the system without having any preconceived ideas or biases. Therefore, it's impossible for therapists to be completely objective when working with clients. It's impossible for us to approach our work with family systems or any other systems with a completely objective stance. All we can do is be aware of our own biases and beliefs and realize that we are doing therapy subjectively. If we are aware of this, we are more able to listen to clients and their unique realities rather than imposing our reality on them. Okay, so I want to really drive this point home because this is a really important one and this is a really practical aspect of what we do as therapists that so often we forget and so we so seldomly talk about it, but it's such a big part of the endeavor of therapy. We are not machines We are not pre-programmed instruments. We are not designed to be objective because we're human. And because we're human, and because we each have our own epistemologies, as we talked about earlier in the trimester, we each have our own unique views of the world, which have been influenced by what we've learned and where we've lived and who we've interacted with and what we've come to believe. Because of that, it's impossible for us to work with families and understand the issues that they're presenting with and intervene without doing so subjectively, without everything that we think and presume and impose on them being filtered through our own realities. It's impossible for us to do away with that filter. It's impossible for us to do away with our subjectivity. The best that we can do is to be aware of it, to know that it exists, and to be able to contain it, acknowledge it, while at the same time being open to our clients' realities. An example of this that came up for me was not too long ago. I got a divorce, and while I was going through the process of divorce, I was doing a whole lot of couple therapy, right? My own ideas about marriage in my personal life were shifting in really significant ways. And if I'll be honest, my ideas about men were shifting in really profound and significant ways. My ideas about myself as a woman were shifting in really important and significant ways, right? And all of this was informing and affecting the way that I observed and understood and thought about marriage in general. Because that's how these things work. Our experiences, what we've gone through, what we've come to believe about our lives and ourselves is infused in how we perceive the world around us and these things in a more general sense. So of course, it's also going to infuse and affect how we understand and how we look at and how we talk to our clients. It would be impossible for me to suddenly become an objective therapist working with my clients, right? That's impossible. I have to do therapy being me. So when I worked with my couples, I had to be very, very careful not to impose my perceptions about marriage based on my own experiences onto my clients. I had to be fully aware of my preconceived ideas and my biases and my skewed perspectives. I had to hold on to those, acknowledge those, and know that they existed when working with my clients in order to be present and open to their realities, and in order to not do harm to my clients by imposing these things on them. Because it would be far too easy for me to sit down with a couple, have them tell me what's going on, and assume, right, and conjecture and hypothesize that certain things were going on with that couple and that certain things should happen with that couple. Maybe that she should leave the husband who hasn't been forthcoming about the finances. Or maybe that it wasn't worth fighting for. Or maybe that it wasn't going to work out in the end. Any kinds of things could have come up for me. But they would have been arising from my own perceptions, from my own position, and not from what I was observing. Does that make sense? So in second order cybernetics, I'm taking into account myself as the observer. And I'm recognizing that what I am seeing is not reality as it is, but reality filtered through my own perception, filtered through my own worldview. And knowing that, I then proceed very cautiously, listening very carefully to my clients and their realities, ensuring that I'm not imposing my reality on them. And guys, when we talk about these things, we are fully in the territory of ethics. An understanding of second order cybernetics calls us to consider our ethical obligation as therapists. If we don't acknowledge how our personal biases influence our observations, our diagnostic impressions, and our interventions with clients, we can very easily end up doing more harm to our clients than good. And it is our ethical imperative, just as it is the ethical imperative of physicians who take the Hippocratic Oath, to first do no harm to our clients. And to avoid doing harm to our clients, it's essential that we recognize our subjectivity. We recognize that we, the observer, are part of everything that we observe, and in knowing that, to proceed cautiously. That is perhaps the biggest ethical responsibility we have to our clients. Before I jump to this slide, I want to go back and I want to invoke the article that you read this week. And one of the things that came up in that article is that as therapists, as diagnosticians, we can't help but be informed by our theories, by our models, by our perceptions, by our biases, by our views of pathology versus health. And whatever theories we have and whatever biases we have are going to determine what we see when a client sits in our office. And what we see when a client sits in our office is going to inform what we do with that client. So think about the implications that has. And think about how easy it would be for a therapist to assume that what they're seeing, what they're believing, and what they're suggesting for their client is the right way, the true way, the only way to approach that client, versus one story about what's happening, grounded in the perspective of the therapist who's doing the observation about that client. If I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist, I'm going to be interested in finding out about my client's thoughts, about my client's beliefs, and about how my client's beliefs and thoughts are influencing my client's behavior. And so I'm going to make certain kinds of suggestions to my client. I might have certain diagnostic impressions of my client based on what I observe about their thoughts. Contrast that with me being a narrative therapist and approaching that client. You're going to learn some more about narrative therapy later on in the program. I'm going to be looking at my client's story about him or herself and the problem. And I'm going to be looking for exceptions to that problem, times when the problem wasn't a problem. And I'm going to be looking at ways to tease apart the problem itself from the client so that the client no longer perceives him or herself as the problem. And I'm going to be making certain suggestions for the client or asking certain questions of the client. And I'm going to be making different decisions about when therapy is done than that cognitive behavioral therapist would have made. And it would be very easy for the cognitive behavioral therapist to believe that what he or she was observing from the client was the truth about that client versus just his or her story of that client, his or her reality about that client. And it would be just as easy for the narrative therapist to do the very same thing. It's essential that we recognize that our observations, our perceptions, and our interventions are all filtered through our own personally situated perspectives. And we have to acknowledge that that filter exists in order for us to prevent our biases from influencing our observations and impressions and interventions to the degree that we do harm to our clients. So now I want you to consider this. I want you to think about, as a therapist, or as a coach, what types of clients you think would be the most challenging for you to work with, and why? And then I want you to think about what you would do if you began working with a client or a client family and then realized that your personal perceptions, beliefs, or biases would keep you from being able to work effectively with them. Because here's the truth. There are always going to be clients who stoke personal reactions for you because whatever material they're bringing to the room or whatever qualities they might possess are going to resonate with something personal for us, are going to stir up something in us that makes it challenging for us to put aside our biases and connect with the client and connect with their reality. And so what happens when we encounter that? What do we do? How do we proceed? In most cases, our ethical responsibility is to work through it. And again, to contain our biases and to contain our personal perceptions in order to be able to be present for our clients' realities and to work with them appropriately. But in some cases, we find ourselves unable to do this. And so what happens next? Well, this is a time for supervision, most certainly, or colleague consultation if you're not under supervision. And it may be the time to make a referral. And you as a therapist or you as a coach are going to have to make your own decisions about when you know whether your perceptions, beliefs, and biases are going to get in the way of you being able to help your client. And if they are, you're not the therapist for that client. So it's really important for all of us in our work as therapists to always be aware of our biases, to be aware of our limits, to be aware of the places at which we're really challenged and have difficulty. There were days when it was excruciating to work with couples when I was going through my own divorce. Probably most excruciating to work with happy couples who came in for some other presenting problem. But I didn't need to refer my clients in that case, and I didn't need to stop working with my clients in that case. I simply needed to be aware that because of the resonance between what they were bringing in with them, which was their status as a married couple, or in other cases, their presenting problem being a marital issue, I simply needed to be aware that there was resonance between that and my own experience. And I needed to acknowledge my perceptions and impressions and biases that were coming out of my own experience in order to be able to meet them where they were and address their experiences rather than imposing upon them my own stuff. Some of you may have had personal experiences with things like addiction or abuse, for example, that may make it really, really difficult for you to set aside your own preconceived ideas, your own biases, in order to sit with your clients in their realities, in that discomfort, and be present for them. And so part of your ethical responsibility as a therapist, as a second-order cybernetician, if you will, is to remember that as an observer of systems, you are part of what you observe. And it's essential that you be a second-order cybernetic therapist and take into consideration your role as a participant in the system that you're observing. And to recognize that that begins at the moment you meet your client. Because everything that you notice about your client, everything that you focus on, everything that you assume, everything that you believe is filtered through your own perception, is filtered through your own reality. And reality, as we briefly talked about at the beginning of the trimester, is a personal construction. Each of us has our own unique reality. And in every case, we're all going to have our own reality about the same event. If we were all in the same room together and some situation were to take place, and someone were then to come in and interview each one of us about what happened, the interviewer would come out of it with a variety of different stories. And for each of us, that story was the truth, was the reality of what happened. Because when we describe something, we also describe ourselves. We also reveal how we see the world, what we notice, what we pay attention to, how we describe things, how we judge things, how we characterize things. Second-order cybernetics allows us as therapists to respect the multiple realities of each client, as well as our own realities. That's why we're so effective. That's what makes us systemic. That's what sets us apart from traditional intrapsychic therapists. Right? Not only do we view things in relational terms, not only do we view things in context, but when we're working from a second-order perspective, we're also recognizing that each of our clients has a unique reality grounded in their upbringing, in their belief systems, in their experiences, in their relationships. And we honor their unique reality. And we also attend to our own unique reality and recognize that we have our own reality. And in recognizing that, we don't impose ours upon our clients. And this is really, really important. This idea about understanding multiple realities is really important when we actually have multiple family members in the room with us. When we're sitting with a mom, a dad, and their 3 children. Recognizing that each one of those individual people in our office has a completely distinct and unique reality of what's going on. And our job, which is not easy, is to hold each one of those distinct realities at the same time. To honor and respect each and one of those unique realities at the same time, and recognize that not a single one of them represents the true reality, the truth with a capital T that we talked about earlier in the trimester. And most importantly, we recognize that our reality of what's going on also isn't the ultimate truth with a capital T. Every person's reality is valid. And here's the other thing, which shouldn't be a surprise to you. Every person's reality makes sense when understood in context. So our job as therapists is to do a whole lot of sense making. How does it make sense that this family, that these parents, think that putting half a bar of soap in their child's mouth is an appropriate response to the child using a swear word? How does it make sense in the context of this family's culture, or this family's country of origin, or this family's traditions? How does it make sense? And see, that's a very different position, a very curious, respectful position. It's quite different from us saying, this is child abuse, this is terrible, these are awful parents, and they need to be stopped. And I need to tell them how wrong they are. Think about the implications. Think about the difference between what's likely to happen in the session in scenario 1 with the curious therapist who's aware that reality is grounded in context, and that when we look at context, we can make sense of behavior, versus scenario 2, where the therapist's reality, where the therapist's perspective, where the therapist's biases become the reality of what's going on with the clients. When we're taking the second order perspective, the second order cybernetics perspective, and we are considering ourselves, the observers, as part of the system, as part of what we're observing, it becomes far more likely for us to live in scenario 1 in our work as therapists with curiosity, compassion, and respect for multiple perspectives than it is for us to fall into scenario 2, where our truth becomes the truth and where we take a big risk of doing harm to our clients. So I want you to have some fun this week. I've given you a lot to think about. And next week we're going to be doing more second order cybernetics. And of course, between the weeks, we're going to be talking about this on the discussion board. So for now, I want you to have a little bit of fun with this. I want you to think about what I said before regarding multiple perspectives and how each individual's reality is grounded in his or her context, is grounded in his or her unique perspective of the situation. So I want you to tell the story of Cinderella, right? The popular story that we all know pretty well, from the perspective of each of the individual characters. Now, of course, there are many characters in Cinderella, right? But the main characters, Cinderella, the stepmother, the ugly stepsisters, and the prince. Let's think about them. I want you, just as a thought exercise, maybe you even want to write it down on paper, to think about how that story would be told if it was told from the perspective of each of those people I just named. If rather than telling the story from Cinderella's perspective, which is essentially the story we all know, what would the story sound like? What would the story look like if it were told from the stepmother's perspective, from the ugly stepsister's perspective, from the prince's perspective? What changes? How does the story change? And how does the story make sense differently when grounded in the context of different participants in the story? So have fun with that. Like I said, we're going to keep the conversation going in the discussion board. And in the meantime, here are the concepts from this week that you can go ahead and log and keep in mind for your upcoming short papers. Obviously, we talked about second order cybernetics in a very general sense. So that is, of course, one of the concepts for this week. We talked about constructivism and constructivist epistemology. And lastly, we talked about multiple perspectives and multiple realities. Next week, we're going to be covering some other second-order cybernetic concepts. And again, I ask you, as always, to pose any questions that you have that are remaining from this week's readings and this week's lecture to the discussion board so that we can all talk about it and feel ready to tackle Week 9's lecture and Week 9 concepts when we get to it next week. I hope you all have a great one, and I will see you on the discussion board and back here next week. Take care.